Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as we do each week on the Roundup, we take our questions from the themes we see developing in the news stories of the previous week. And for those that aren't familiar, we do a newsletter here at SMIE Consulting. And in case you're wondering, that stands for Social Media and International Education Consulting. And I've dropped the link to our website, smieconsulting.org and /subscribe, where you can subscribe to that newsletter. And there are 2 different versions of it available. The one that you can get to at the website is our email version of it. And that email version comes out Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. And that is direct into your inbox to give you a sampling of social media stories in the world of international education. Oftentimes these are webinar announcements, blog posts that are particularly relevant and attractive, upcoming data sets that are important, overlaps of where social media is coming into play regarding messaging apps and other things like that, and how they're being used in different countries. So it covers those social media stories, also covers what's happening in the United States, some of the news and highlights of what's happening with some of the organizations in international ed space, as well as some of the highlights in government action and stories related to international ed topics in the United States, some solutions that different authors have presented on different topics, resources that are available that I may want to make you aware of, and then a global roundup of the different countries that are dealing with international education issues. And knowing what is happening in other countries is an important way of helping you better educate yourself on how you can potentially be adjusting how you talk about your institution in more global context, not just how you compare to your U.S. Neighbors. So that's what we have in terms of the newsletter, in terms of content each day, each week on Monday when it comes out. And as I said, you can get either the email version, or if you prefer to get your international ed news from LinkedIn, there is a very helpful link I'll drop in with this past Monday's chat version of the newsletter. Both combined, we have over 1,950 subscribers to the 2 different versions of the newsletter. So very excited that so many professionals in the field are using this as part of their international edification each week. So thanks again for being a part of the SMIE community. Those news stories are quick hot takes of what is happening in our field from the previous week. And then on Wednesdays here on the Midweek Roundup, we go more in depth into 3 of those themes that we've seen developing and answer those and in the context of how we can potentially adjust how we do what we do and where we do it, why we do it in terms of our outlook on international education. So that's the newsletter versions that you can get. Please do subscribe if you aren't already. Then we'll get right into our first question, and that is, how is your international alumni strategy going? And many of you are saying, what international alumni strategy? We don't have one of those. We'd love to, but we just don't have the time or resources or willing partners on campus to really make it happen. And I will say at most institutions, that is probably the single biggest roadblock to identifying all 3 of those are type of problems that can really hinder international student recruitment initiatives in moving forward with an extra tool in your tool belt. And when I say that, I'm talking about the time that you have to manage those relationships, the willingness of the alumni office to help in those endeavors, and third, the access to information, frankly, about who your international alumni are. Some institutions, and I won't name names, but some institutions have told me that we don't even have a database where we track international applicants or international alumni because the address fields don't fit in our CRM. So we don't make it, it doesn't work for us. So some really interesting reasons why international alumni aren't happening. But for many of us, if we're one-person operations or small shops, we probably just don't have bandwidth to make that happen. So the article that I'm referring to that's asking this question about alumni strategies is actually from our friends at INTED, and they have very always regular producers of fantastic content that can be applied to how you do what you do in international education. And their question is in one of their most recent blogs, are you ready for an international alumni strategy? So I asked, how's it going? But many of you might not be ready for that yet. But this is the question that they ask. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I had the honor of authoring a chapter in a recent book that was published on entry points to U.S. education. Came out the week of NAFSA. Very excited. My first book chapter that I've written that talks about the 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management, and that is my chapter is part of the book that the folks at INTED have also contributed a couple chapters to. One in particular is on leveraging alumni, digital, and so much more. So in terms of that book, if you haven't already gotten it yet, I would recommend that you do. It's kind of a must-have, I think, for covering the variety of issues that are facing international education, particularly in the United States these days. And this is a book I'm so proud to be a part of, and really encourage you all to get it. But the chapter that the folks at INTED wrote on international alumni, very helpful in terms of laying out the various issues that you need to take into consideration when you are trying to create something that doesn't exist yet, or adopt maybe a domestic version of what's going on with alumni in terms of how they plug and play with your recruitment efforts, but make it doing that internationally. So it really is, there's a nice tool that the folks at INTED have developed called the International Alumni and Recruitment Preparedness tool that you can access through the link that I'm posting in the chat. Really recommend taking advantage of that. That can give you some really strong resources to help guide you along your way related to developing your own strategy on international alumni and how they can fit in. I mean, sometimes for recruiters like myself who've been traveling internationally, if you know that there are alums, maybe recent grads that you've worked with to recruit and now have gone back home, and you know that they're there, you often want to make them a regular part of your travel plans, at least have coffee or dinner with them, maybe go out for a drink, whatever, just to identify who they are in market. And then it may be all hodgepodge, hit and miss, where you have these folks. But when you can approach it from the mindset of, all right, let's build something here. There are going to be international graduates who stay in the United States, and there are ways that you can leverage them in terms of they're working in the United States, and those examples that they set are great future recruitment tools for those that do maybe want to stay in the U.S. From their countries and see what the possibilities are. So it's not always just about convincing a student that your campus is going to be a great experience for them, but they want to know, the students, future students want to know, and their parents want to know oftentimes, is what is the outcomes going to be? What will my son or daughter get for the $250,000 or more that I'm investing in their undergraduate education, or the $100,000 that we're investing in a graduate education, whatever it is. So having those outcomes is as important, if not more so, than having the students on campus who can speak to their successes while they've been a student. You want those end results people too. And there are ways that you can capture those testimonials through videos, through interviews, through responses to questions that you can later formulate into testimonials on a website. Maybe have some video content that you can shoot, maybe something in native language for parents and future students. All of these are things that you can and should do. Things that you do for current students and how to involve them in your recruitment processes. You can do so also for alumni and many other opportunities too, particularly if they are back home in their home countries, and having, depending on the countries you're recruiting in, where your alumni are, and identifying those places is key, who the active ones are, who the ones that want to be involved are. What we really need to focus on are how to leverage what their excitement for their alma mater into helping future students tap into that as well, and future students and their parents know who those people are, and to have people that they can ask questions of locally in their native language. That's all going to be gold for you if you can and do build a network of these kind of folks throughout your recruitment markets. So, for example, at UNLV, where I currently work as Director of Global Recruitment and Partnerships, I was in Thailand for a week with our IIE's International Academic Partnership Program. We had a week in Thailand visiting universities in Bangkok and 2 or 3 different cities throughout Thailand. We had a one day where we met with 29 different institutions across the country, some of which we'd visited their campuses, some we hadn't, for opportunities to talk about what the possibilities might be for partnerships. But before we had that week, I was traveling with our Associate Vice Provost for undergraduate education and high impact practices, and he and I both talked about getting in touch with our alumni office to see, hey, do we have any alumni in Bangkok that we could potentially call and have a little drinks event at the hotel we were staying in. And we were able to do that. We had found about 20, but it was right during Songkla, the Thai New Year, and we weren't expecting a whole lot to happen. We found 20 that we invited. I think we had over a dozen respond. 6 were able to show up. The other 6 that responded said, hey, we're out in different parts of the country with family at the time. So we had 6 alumni from our institution show up in Bangkok. 2 from our business program, 2 from hospitality, 2 from engineering. So really nice dynamics there, representing 3 different decades, the 90s, the noughties, and the teens. And they were all able to interact together, and they didn't know each other beforehand, creating their own little mini UNLV network in the country. So that's becoming now a part of what I'm going to be doing with all my future trips. And now that I'm building in and have a kind of a model in place with our alumni office to kind of identify in key markets who those people are and how we might be able to get in touch with them, and what alumni can do in terms of giving us some swag we can hand out, information about the Alumni Association, all of that. And along the way, asking those that are interested, particularly the natives from those countries, hey, are you interested in helping us in recruiting future generations of students from your country? And getting at least 3 of the 6 that I had identified as good potential role models for future students to hear from in video format. So we're working on developing a series of videos in the next year that will help leverage some of these students, former students and successful graduates of our institution in future recruitment efforts. So that's happening. That's part of our alumni strategy. And this is all part of how you don't know until you ask, hey, do we even have lists of who these students are? How do we track these? And our alumni office was flexible and was willing to work with us. And we asked the question, hey, can you run use Handshake to try and see where these folks are, how many are in Bangkok? And they were able to nail down a fairly good list for us. So we at least had something to go on. And it turned out really well. And something we're definitely going to be replicating in other areas. But the Inted article certainly goes into a lot of depth on what you can expect and what you need to look out for as you're developing that strategy. And there are a lot of other pieces to that puzzle, but I certainly wanted to share with you what they are doing specifically at Inted and what their recommendations are for moving forward on that front. Now, that's the first question of the day for us in terms of the midweek roundup. The second one is, why should you focus on international student outcomes? And this alumni piece is somewhat connected to this, obviously, because they're the living, breathing examples of the outcomes for your institution internationally. And why you should focus on international student outcomes, we've talked about this on a number of different levels in the past. We've seen over the past month or so all the various student surveys that have come out. The Student Barometer survey, the granddaddy of them all, came out this past week, and they also said how important career outcomes are to prospective students in their choices and selection of institutions. And it's been kind of the biggest change in these student surveys, or for why students are choosing institutions. It used to be rankings. It used to then be quality. It used to be, and depending on where you are in the world, it was affordability. There are a lot of different factors that go in, depending on which country you're looking at, depending on the time. But what we've seen almost universally across the board since the pandemic is a real switch towards practical outcomes. What is my son or daughter getting for the education I'm paying for? So having data is the best solution, not just general institutional data that most all of us will have. 80% of our graduates are employed within 6 months of graduation. That's great, and that's something at least, but it's not specific to international, because international students, as we all know who are in the business, they have very different rules that apply to them. There are maybe a recent survey I saw this past week, only 40%, 41% or so of international students stay in the U.S. longer term post-graduation. So that means 60% go home or go to a third country. So that in the longer term, not immediately, but so there's three different options, right, for international students. Leave the country, either go home to their home country or to a third country, stay in the U.S. to work, or stay in the U.S. to go to further graduate study. So those three buckets are where most students fit in. So having data on outcomes for particularly those two buckets in the U.S. for further graduate study, percentage that get admitted to graduate programs, percentage that get jobs after graduation for your international students, that's the kind of data that everybody should work towards having. Not everybody's going to have it right away because it's a lift to kind of parse out that data, but there are ways that you can gather it, and gathering that from your OPT data that your ISSS office collects, or that the students actually input and is collected in SEVIS, you can gather it that way. It's not the most easily sortable system as many ISSS folks will attest to get data out of, but at least it's there for where students are working, and potentially even salaries that you can parse out. So this is something that you want to get towards, getting those kind of data points that you can refer to parents and students at fairs and in Conflow messaging about what's out there. One institution in particular is doing a fantastic job of that, and that's Lehigh University. There was an article out from the Free Press Journal. It's actually an India-based article that has an article that says Lehigh University boasts 98% employment rate for international graduates. And when I saw that title of that article, I just lost it. It's like, are you kidding me? 98%, and they've got the data to back this up. And you read this article and you see it. It's they have made it a priority at the institution to really gather that information, have it available to you, and where they're getting it from their CPT, OPT data. We reach out. There's actual outreach that's done by the institution to these graduates to find out where they are, salaries, graduate school admissions, enrollment, like the things I was just talking about. And this is so valuable. In India, my goodness me, if you have data like this that says that 98% of your international student graduates have jobs, that is phenomenal. That is recruitment gold. And not just in India, but other countries as well. But certainly in India, that is hypersensitive on employment rates and anything to do with employment longer term in the United States. So we've been talking about that a lot lately. We had Trump's announcement last week or the week and a half ago about green cards for all U.S. college graduates from overseas. That whether that happens or not, that's a long road to get to, but we'll see what happens. But that raised a lot of eyebrows. It's like, well, really? That would be something else, wouldn't it? Game changer was a lot of people have said, and I certainly was one of those that if and when, and a lot of if and whens that would, and many people are very skeptical about it. But if and when it ever did happen, everyone in international education would be shouting from the rafters at how much of a significant change, positive change, this would be for how we recruit international students, and making that clear pathway for them that if they want to stay in the United States, they can get a green card if they graduate. That would be just a huge boost and would knock every other destination market out of the park in terms of what they could expect from us moving forward. We have always been limited by a lack of national and international ed policy in the United States, but this would go a long way to making the process for international students a much more attractive one to come to the United States for not only education, but a guarantee that they'd be able to stay and work a longer term and without worrying about visas and after they finish their undergraduate, graduate degrees. So having that data, like the Lehigh article shares, is just so significant and a game changer for how you can
If
be
you work with
viewed
PDFs at all, you
in the
need Adobe
variety
Acrobat.
of
You can edit, share,
articles
sign
that
PDFs, and
we're
more.
talking
The
about
whole
here.
PDF.
Now, one thing I do want to share, though, where it is a little bit more of a challenge for all of us in international education is sometimes we get some very positive signs that the government is paying attention and listening on this front. Sometimes they have foot and mouth disease and they can't. They really make some gaffes that they don't realize necessarily the implications of, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. But one in particular was when it comes to outcomes and the kinds of students we want and do attract to the United States. There was an article this past week in the Economic Times in India, picked up there because it was from a number 2 U.S. diplomat that shared his desire that the U.S. needs more Indians in STEM fields. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's kind of stereotypical, but okay. And then he said, well, and we also need more Chinese students in the humanities. And it's kind of an off-the-cuff remark, but the reality is there's political reasoning behind that. Those that obviously weathered the Trump administration knew that STEM fields were particularly targeted in terms of Chinese students coming to the United States for special administrative processing, that those that were coming from institutions that were part of the military civil fusion strategy in China that were kind of funded and suspected of having espionage interests in sending students from their institutions to the U.S. for study. There was that kind of shadow hanging over Chinese STEM students. Is that a complete and utter total ban? No, it's not. But it's a reality that a perception has become reality for a lot of students' eyes in China that might be been wanting to come to the U.S. for STEM related fields. So is this statement going to put them off more? It's not helping, and I'll be very blunt about that. The statement by the number 2 man in the State Department to basically poo-poo any hopes of Chinese students in non-humanities areas coming to the United States or coming in STEM fields would not being encouraged. It didn't say that outright, but he said that's what we need is more Chinese humanities students. And that's how it's been received in Beijing. It's being seen as a slap in the face, and everything's a slap in the face to China when it comes to any policy decisions that maybe don't view China favorably across the board. So it's a little bit of a lack of surprise that China is reacting the way they have to this response, to this statement by the number 2 person in the State Department. So, but focusing on outcomes isn't always easy, but having the data is ideal. If you can't have the data, having anecdotal stories and or testimonials from your alums or recent graduates about what they're getting, what they've got out of their experience, that's great. That's ideal as well. But having both is even better. So where you can have those anecdotal stories from your alumni that share exactly what their outcomes are through video, through testimonials, through ComFlows, on website profiles, whatever it might be. Having that plus the data is really the best case scenario when it comes to focusing on international student outcomes. And why is that important? Because that's what future students want to hear. So let's shift gears in the last few minutes that we have here and talk about a topic that certainly in the United States has had its moments in terms of how significant an issue it has become. Certainly not as much recently because it's become more common practice, and that's regarded to agents, agent training, agent education, agent regulation. And in terms of regulation in the United States, we don't have regulations other than financial aid regulations in the U.S. that prohibit U.S. institutions paying agents on a per head basis for domestic students to enroll at their institutions. Internationally, there had been in the late noughties part of the NACAC, National Association of College Admissions Counseling, had a ban. It's more of a in their ethical code of conduct. Had a ban on commission-based agents that was eventually removed in the teens. And at a time back in the noughties, there were maybe 25 to 30% of U.S. institutions that were using educational agents as part of their recruitment efforts. Now we're well over half of U.S. colleges who are recruiting internationally are using educational agents as part of their strategy. So the larger question, and this is not specifically in the U.S. This is more of a global one, is what's the future of agent regulations globally? And globally in the United States, let's take U.S. as a first example. Other than that financial aid prohibition on commission-based agent payments, U.S. colleges can and do that. But there are no regulations really in the United States that affect their how they have to be trained, how they are certified. That all kind of started organically through AIRC in 2008 when that organization was founded. They have since evolved to become the U.S.-based agency organization that accredits, certifies educational agents around the world. Now, their kind of clientele for the agencies that are part of AIRC tend to be the larger ones out there because it's expensive. It's about $10,000 to go through the accreditation process at AIRC. And again, that's for those that want to be accredited and recognized in the United States. And many universities use that AIRC list as a starting point for, or maybe even their only place they go for looking for agents to work with. Certainly, I wouldn't go exclusively with that list because there are many smaller mom and pop shops that are strong and above board agents, and completely ethical in terms of how their practices are, how they respond to universities, all of that. So for the U.S., it's kind of one stop. There's the AIRC. There's no government regulations involved. If they AIRC accredited, no. Okay, well then either choose to go with them or you choose not to. So what is happening in other countries is actually there's much more of a focus on, is government going to have to step in and provide a framework for regulations to exist. In the UK, they've had their agent quality control process for British Council trained and educated agents. They have in Australia, agents have become a target for some of the reasons why the Australian government has introduced migration targets that are 50% lower than what they were. And that's for all migration to Australia. But to reduce those numbers by half, and universities and colleges that enroll vocational students into their colleges, and university students, more so on the vocational side, that are where there are some of the dodgy providers in terms of that are funneling students to campuses, particularly colleges, vocational colleges, are kind of under the gun and being targeted for closure, hopefully, in the Australian government side. You see in Canada, the public-private partnerships that affect vocational colleges there also significantly impacted by stories of agents that have gone rogue and have done some really horrendous things with students in terms of how they have sold them a bill of goods that they're not have no chance of fulfilling in Canada. You see in the UK similar issues, though not so much on the agent side, but certainly the issues of an agent framework quality framework is very much a part of discussions going on now, and who needs to oversee that. There are a couple articles, one of which is from the ICEF Monitor, and that's on who decides about quality education agents and the question of increased regulation. And the other is an op-ed piece in the University World News from my colleague Luis Nicol, based in Malaysia, that's focused on the UK. It says, "Student Recruitment, an Industry Too Long in the Shadows." And she goes into the topic of agent regulations and talks about transparency being the key, and how that is what's been lacking in terms of really understanding which agents do what, are responsible for different practices. So she makes the case quite clearly that that this is something that self-regulation, as well as the ICF monitor, argue that there are, in response to these growing calls for regulation, that the broad consensus within the industry is that self-regulation is the most effective path forward. And from the ICF monitor, an effective global model for self-regulation includes three key components: a carefully articulated code of conduct, comprehensive training programs for agency-based counselors, and a global accreditation scheme to verify the bona fides and good conduct of agencies. Now, ICF obviously has a lot of skin in the game. They've already accredited 2,000 agencies, educational agencies, and have another 1,000 or so in the process of accreditation. They are probably, other than the British Council, probably the global leader, I can say, in terms of agent training for not just the United States, but all countries. So they have their workshops around the world that are very expensive for institutions to join. The agents basically are paid for by the fees that the universities pay to attend, $5,000, $6,000 a pop to go to these 2-day events usually. So those things, they have a very significant stake in this answer to this question about regulations and accreditation and regulation of by governments, or self-regulation, as most in the industry would prefer. The question is, will governments allow that? And that's something that, given the proclivities in the UK, Australia, Canada, to really clamp down on migration that they see as out of control, how are they going to see success just by letting the industry kind of regulate itself, or will they introduce government watchdogs or create a whole new infrastructure to manage regulations of agencies? So that's a question, a much larger question that we don't have time to go into too much today, but certainly there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the agent regulation questions. And certainly every country is going to have slightly different takes on this. But in the United States, we're always the independent ones. We like to do things on our own. And so ours would be certainly the self-regulation in terms of the industry. And that's the way it's always been. I don't see the government ever stepping in to get involved with us. So that's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup. Thanks again for those who have watched live and those that are watching on repeat on our social channels, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, or X, and those listening on any major podcast providers where we're now well over 3,500 downloads. So very excited about how the Roundup is being received, as well as the newsletter. So that's all we have for you today. So we look forward to chatting with you again next week, and I wish everybody in the U.S. a very happy Independence Day tomorrow and a relaxing and restful weekend. Cheers.